What's up guys, welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today we're going to be talking about 6 offshore bass fishing secrets the pros don't want you to know about. So let's get right into it.
Number 1. Always graph over offshore spots before you fish them. Okay, so some of you guys may have heard this one before on the Bassmasters or from reading other publications on offshore bass fishing, but the pros don't go into a lot of depth on why they say you should graph over a spot before you fish them. So let me break it down for you and explain exactly why they do it and why it helps you become a better offshore bass fisherman. Okay, so first up, if you don't know how to read your bass fishing electronics and you don't understand what the images are telling you, check out this video in the top right corner. It's a complete guide to bass fishing electronics that I made, and it breaks it down from the very basics and it gets pretty advanced. And in the video, you'll learn exactly how to identify fish on your graph, which is going to be really helpful when you're graphing over all these spots. Okay, so the first reason you should graph over offshore spots before you fish them is because if you're graphing in deeper than 10 feet of water, you should be able to see fish actually on a ledge or a hump or in a brush pile or any kind of structure or cover you'll graph over. And if you can see those fish on a piece of structure or around a piece of cover, you can get them to bite at some point in the day. And 9 times out of 10, if you don't see fish on your graph, when you graph over a spot, you're not going to catch anything there. And that might seem pretty obvious and straightforward to you guys, but I know from experience that it's a lot easier said than done to graph for 2 or 3 hours looking for fish on your graph without picking up a fishing rod. And that's what you have to do a lot of times when you're fishing offshore structure. You have to graph and graph and graph until you see the right thing on your graph. And a lot of times you'll wonder, okay, what am I looking for even? But then when you see it on your screen, you're like, oh, that's super obvious. That's definitely fish. And here's some images right here of places that are just loaded with fish. And, a lot of times you'll graph and be like, man, maybe that has some fish on it, maybe it doesn't. But from my experience, if you know what you're looking at on your graph and you see a spot with fish, you're going to know it immediately. So again, check out that video I talked about at the beginning. It'll tell you or show you what you need to be looking for, but you're going to see, when you see it, you're going to know that it's a spot that has fish. And the second reason you want to graph over a spot before you fish it is you want to see how those fish are related to the bottom or to the cover. So to explain that, let me give you some examples. In this first image, these fish are sitting right on the bottom. You can see the little dots here, and they're right next to the bottom. Those are bass sitting on top of a ledge. And whenever I see fish near the bottom, I'm going to fish baits like a crankbait or a jig or something that gets into the bottom, digs in those rocks. And normally when fish are on the bottom, they're really active and they're going to be easy to catch. But if we look at this next spot here, you'll see these fish are not on the bottom. They're actually suspended 3 or 4 feet off the bottom. And if you tried to fish a jig or a crankbait on these fish, you're not going to get nearly as many bites because those baits are working on the bottom underneath those fish. And so instead of fishing the bottom baits, you have to fish baits that target those suspended bass like a swim bait or a jigging spoon or a hair jig. And if you didn't graph over the spot before fishing it, you might have made the mistake of just fishing a football jig and dragging it on the bottom, and you may not catch a single fish. But because you did graph over it, you can see that they're suspended, and you can throw the right bait to match that situation. And this is super important to offshore fishing because a lot of times bass will position different ways on different days and in different conditions. So some days the fish will sit up right next to the bottom, sometimes they'll suspend. And so if you come by and fish a spot one day and you're wearing them out on a jig and you're dragging it on the bottom, and then come back the next day and you fish that spot and you're not getting a single bite, it may be because those fish suspended above that drop and you're just fishing right underneath them. And you may have not graphed over that spot to see if those fish were suspended or if they're on the bottom. And so even though you're fishing the same spot, the fish will set up differently on different days. And one thing that people are always worried about when I tell them to graph over a spot before fishing it is that they're going to spook the fish. And from experience, I can tell you that fish really aren't that bothered by driving a boat right over the top of them. And even when the water is really shallow, let's say 6 or 7 feet of water, you can drive your boat and idle it right across a brush pile or a rock pile and then turn around and make casts in there and catch fish. It doesn't really bother them that much. They're used to boat traffic. Especially when the water's deeper than 10 feet, it really doesn't matter. Now, if you're fishing a brush pile, let's say in 4 or 5 feet of water, and you drive right over the top of it, you may not get as many bites as if you had fished it without driving over the top of it. But still, you're going to probably get some bites, and you really might be surprised by that, but I've done it countless times throughout the summer on different lakes all around the country. So those fish are not as bothered by the engine noise as you would think. Number 2. Timing is key when fishing offshore for bass. So this is probably another one that you guys have heard before, but it probably wasn't fully explained because a lot of the pros and local anglers like to keep all the information close to the vest and not share everything, but we're going to break it all down now so you guys fully understand. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times fish will relate different ways to offshore structure depending on the conditions. And remember I said that sometimes they'll sit on the bottom and then sometimes they'll suspend on different days. And that all comes down to the weather conditions, the time of day, and the current that's running through the lake. And so all of those are going to affect how the fish position, when they pull up to feed, and how you have to fish for them to get them to bite. So let's run through all those conditions really quick and show you how they affect offshore bass. And just a quick call out, most of my fishing is done in the south on largemouth, and some of these things I'm talking about might not directly apply to smallmouth or different lakes around the country, and so just use these as general guidelines. They might not be hard, fast rules depending on the type of fish you're going after and the area of the country you're in. So first up is current, and current is probably the most important factor for offshore bass fishing, especially in the summertime. And if I'm using a lot of terminology you're not understanding, check out these 2 videos here. The video on the left is a complete guide to contour line maps, and it'll explain all of the different offshore structures that I'm talking about in this video, and it uses real life examples to make it really easy to understand. And then the video on the left is a complete guide to offshore ledge fishing, and it'll explain what a ledge is. This is like the most common type of offshore structure you're going to find, and it'll be a really good base to understand the rest of this video. So check out those 2 videos if you don't know what I'm talking about this far in the video. So how does current affect offshore bass? Well, mainly what current does is it's going to position the fish on top of ledges, on top of drops, and outside of those brush piles. Those fish are going to get in a position where they can easily ambush bait, because when you have that current, it's going to push the plankton around, which is going to get the bait fish active, and it's going to make those feeding opportunities a lot easier for the bass. And so the fish are just going to be a lot more active offshore when there's current. And in general, when you do have current, bass are going to hang tighter to cover, and they're going to hang tighter to the bottom. And so what that means is that when there's really strong current, those bass are going to be sitting right on the bottom, right near the lip of a drop, or they're going to be sitting right next to a brush pile. They might not be deep in that brush pile, but they're going to be close to that brush pile behind it so that they're kind of blocked from the current, and they're going to sit and wait for those shad to come around the top of that drop or around the edge of that brush pile, and they'll pull out and ambush them. And when there is a lot of current, my favorite bait to throw is a deep diving crankbait. And the reason for that is because I can either work it on the bottom, on top of those ledges, or I can work it on the edges of those brush piles and bang it through the limbs of the brush piles. And because those bass are waiting to ambush shad, they're going over the tops of the ledges or through those brush piles, they'll come out and just crush that crankbait. And then when there's no current, the fish are either going to suspend over the top of a drop, like you see here, or they're going to get really deep into cover. So if there's a brush pile or a tree or grass, they're going to suck down into that grass or into that brush pile and sit really tight in there. And you have to work your baits in the hearts of that cover, or you're going to have to fish for those suspended bass with a swim bait or with a jigging spoon, something like that. So what types of things create current on your lake? Well, first off, the wind. That's the most obvious, and it's on every lake in the country. There's wind everywhere, and when you get a wind that's more than 10 miles an hour, you'll normally get some good current going across the top of offshore structure. And so whenever I get a really windy day, I get really excited because it's going to position those fish really well to catch offshore. The next source of current are locks and dams. And on a lot of lakes, especially river systems, you're going to have a lock or a dam that regulates the water level on your lake. And if you have any man-made reservoirs, there's going to be some sort of water regulation system. And whenever you get too much water in the lake, they'll pull the lake down, or too little, they will bring more water in. That all creates current, and it makes those fish really bite offshore. And then another thing that affects offshore bass fishing is the time of day. And this is extremely important, especially in the late summertime and in the winter. So let's start off with the late summertime. In late summertime, the best time of day to fish is in the middle of the afternoon, 1 or 2 o'clock. And the reason for that is because shad in the late summertime will actually start rising to the surface, and they'll get shallower. They'll push up into shallow water later in the day, and a lot of people don't realize that. And what will happen is that even if there's no current or no wind, if it's a bright bluebird sky and super sunny, those shad will pull up into that shallow water and the bass will follow them. And there's normally a really good feeding window in the last hour or two of a tournament day, which would be 1 to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So if you're fishing late summertime, try to be in your best spots right at the end of your tournament day, or again in that mid-afternoon time. And then the winter time, it's the complete opposite. The best bite is first thing in the morning. And this really only applies to deep, clear lakes. Normally the offshore bite isn't really good on dirty water lakes throughout the wintertime, but if you have a deep, clear lake, what will happen in the mornings is you'll have those low light conditions, and the bass will pull up on top of main lake points and humps in 20 to 30 to 40 feet of water and feed. Then once that sun starts to come over the horizon, they'll pull off and suspend over 100 feet of water in the creek channels. And so the best bite on those winter days is first thing in the morning offshore. And then the last thing that's going to affect those fish when you're fishing offshore is whether it's sunny or cloudy. And again, these conditions are going to affect bass differently in the summer and in the winter. In the summer, those cloudy days are going to cause the fish to get closer to the bottom, and they're going to make them spread out a little bit more. They're not going to be positioned on one particular spot or one little area. They normally will roam a little bit more, and I like to fish crankbaits and spinner baits offshore, or swim bait, something like that I can cover water with, because those fish are not going to set up on one little area. They're going to spread out, they're going to move around, they're going to feed, and normally, like I said, they're going to be closer to the bottom. And so normally these cloudy conditions are pretty good to fish in the summertime. You just have to expand the area you're fishing a little bit because those fish will roam. And then in the summer, when it's sunny, the bass are going to get close to cover offshore, and they're going to get around brush piles, rock piles, anything that throws off shade. And they're going to get really tight to that cover and bury in the middle of brush piles. Or if there's no cover, they're actually going to suspend, and they're going to sit over the top of the drop unless there's really good wind. If there's wind, that'll push them back down to the bottom. But if there's no wind and it's bright sun and there's no cover, those fish are just going to suspend, and they're going to be really hard to catch unless you know what you're doing. And then in the winter, it's really best to be fishing offshore when you have cloudy conditions. Those cloudy conditions are going to simulate that morning time when the fish are really active in the winter, and so the cloudy conditions will keep those fish shallower. It'll keep them up on top of the points and in a little bit easier position to catch. It'll also keep them near the bottom, and so you can catch them on jigs and swim baits and stuff, fishing it a little bit more normal like you would in the summertime. And then when the sun comes out, again, it's going to cause those fish to suspend and sit off the drop and make them a lot harder to catch. It'll also put them suspended around trees or brush, and so you can catch them vertical jigging or fishing a drop shot. But again, those fish are a lot harder to catch, and so normally when I'm fishing offshore in the wintertime, I'm looking for those cloudy conditions and those early morning conditions. Number 3. Look for small groups of fish on your graph to catch bigger bass. Now, this is one I've heard a couple times on the Bassmasters, but the pros definitely keep this one close to their chest. And if you can understand how to identify the smaller groups of bass from the larger groups of bass, you're going to be catching a lot bigger fish. So from personal experience, I've found that whenever I see a ton of dots on my graph, or see fish all over a drop or a brush pile or anything like that, those are going to be smaller fish in general. You might catch some good fish out of a brush top or off a ledge that has 30 or 40 dots on it, but you may only catch a couple good ones, and the rest are going to be, 12 inchers to 2 pounders. And what I've also noticed is that when I find a brush pile or a drop that only has a few fish on it, I might only see 5 or 6 dots down there. Those are going to be spots that hold bigger bass. And so here's a ledge right here where you can see maybe 4 or 5 dots, and this spot was loaded with 3 to 5 pounders. I caught a 6 pounder off here as well. And then here's a brush pile. As you can see, there's just a couple dots in this brush pile, and this is where I caught my personal best bass. It was an 8 pounder, and I caught a couple more 3 pounders out of this brush pile as well. And so if you see a spot that's covered in dots and you see fish everywhere, you'll probably catch a bunch of fish on it, but they may not be that big. And so if you're looking for big fish or you're trying to practice for a tournament, look for brush piles and drops with just a few dots, because those are going to be bigger fish. And even if you don't get those fish to bite in practice, come back, because those bigger fish are really temperamental. And again, you have to fish it at the right time, when the wind's blowing right or you have the right current, things like that. And so you can graph over a spot and not catch fish there, but if you see a spot that has a few dots that are spread across the screen like this, or a few dots in the brush pile, come back and fish it, because you're going to catch some big bass there. Number 4. Offshore bass set up on one key spot on offshore structure or offshore cover. So again, this may be one you guys have heard before on the Bassmasters or in articles, but I cannot stress the importance of this enough. A lot of times, bass offshore will set up on areas as small as the size of a hula hoop, and you have to make the perfect cast and get that bait on one little spot to get those bass to bite. And you also have to fish it at the right angle and with the right retrieve to get them to bite. And these offshore bass can be really temperamental, and if you don't know what that right angle is, or you don't find that key spot, you could miss the mother load of fish by one cast length or just a few feet. So first up, let me give you an example of when I've actually found one of these magical spots. And this is a spot on Lake Dardanelle, and it's a shell bed that was about the size of the front deck of my boat. And there was a giant school of fish that pulled up on the shell bed, and no one had ever found it before. And I actually won a college regional tournament out here off this shell bed, and I finished second in a team tournament the week before against all the locals, and I was fishing by myself. And there's actually a really good spot just down the ledge where a lot of people catch fish, but no one found this little tiny shell bed, and it was one particular cast. I had to make the perfect cast. I had to line myself up perfectly on the bank to get my bait down there, and I had to cast from a very specific angle. I couldn't keep my boat right directly in the channel. I had to be sitting almost perpendicular to the ledge and making a cast up across the top of the ledge rather than straight perpendicular to it. And so all of these factors made it really hard for someone else to pull up on the spot, even though they may have seen me there. And I did see some people pull up on it after I left to try to, poach some fish, but because they didn't know that exact cast, they weren't able to put him in the boat. And so you might be wondering, how did I find this magical cast or this magical spot? Well, what I did is actually drove over this spot in practice, and unfortunately I don't have any screen recordings of this, but I drove my boat down this ledge just like this, and I was able to see a giant group of fish down there, a bunch of dots on my graph, and I just picked up a 10-inch worm and started firing that bait across the top of that ledge, dragging it really slow, and I managed to get one bite off that spot. And right when I got that bite, I looked on the shoreline to see if I could see anything that I could cast at when I made another cast out there, and I saw one boat dock out there. And then I made a waypoint on my graph, and I dropped that waypoint directly underneath my trolling motor. So then what I could do is I could come back to that waypoint after I landed that fish. I could put the trolling motor back on that waypoint, and then I could cast directly at that boat dock. and that allowed me to make the exact cast every time. And if I drifted 10 or 15 feet away from that waypoint or casted 10 or 15 feet away from that boat dock, I would never get a bite. It had to be that exact cast every time to catch that fish. Number 5. If you make more than 10 casts to an offshore structure spot and don't catch a fish, move on to the next area. Now, this is one I know that nobody's talking about, and this is what separates the great offshore fisherman from the mediocre offshore fisherman. It's knowing how many casts to make on a spot and when to leave when you're not getting bit. So I just said that if you don't catch a fish in your first 10 casts on an offshore structure spot, you should leave and go find another area. And I firmly believe that. And looking back at all of the fish I've caught on my YouTube channel, Offshore, every single fish that I've caught has been within the first 10 casts of pulling up on an offshore structure spot. Now, a lot of times I'll have graphed over the spot and I'll have marked the sweet spot, and in those first 10 casts I'll hit that sweet spot, and sometimes that might just come down to luck, but a lot of times it's because I know what I'm looking for on my graph. So if you're new to offshore fishing, maybe make 10 or 15 or 20 more casts, but when you get better, you should be able to graph over a spot, figure out the best angle to cast at just by experience, and then be able to tell if the fish are going to bite within those first 10 casts. And this is extremely important when you're tournament bass fishing, because a lot of times you can waste a lot of your day fishing a spot for 30 or 40 minutes and then not getting any bites and then moving on. And what happens is that if you don't get bit in those first 10 casts, those fish are probably not actively feeding. And so what's happening is that either the time of day isn't right, or you don't have enough current, or it's sunny and you were fishing before in cloudy conditions, things like that. And so a lot of people will just die on these offshore spots because they'll catch a 20-pound bag there in practice, but the conditions change and those fish just aren't there and they're not biting. And it takes a lot of experience to leave a spot where you caught 20 pounds in practice and go look for new water. But those are the type of decisions that separate the mediocre offshore bass fisherman from the great offshore bass fisherman. And I do want to call out that there are times when you can sit on an offshore spot all day and milk it and get a bite every 30 to 45 minutes. I've done that before, and normally you can catch some big bags doing that. And you kind of just have to play that by ear. But again, most of the time, just make those 10 casts. And when you're making those 10 casts, don't just fish the same bait. Make 3 or 4 casts with a jig, then make 2 or 3 casts with a swim bait to try to see if there's any of those fish that are suspended. Maybe fish a shaky head down there, and then maybe throw a crankbait. So in those 10 casts, fish 3 or 4 baits. That way you can determine if you're not fishing the right bait or if the fish actually aren't feeding that day. Number 6. And I don't really know why I'm doing these weird voices when I'm calling out the numbers, but it just kind of seemed necessary, so hope y'all don't mind. Fish as many offshore spots as possible throughout your fishing day. So this is the last offshore secret that the pros aren't going to tell you about when you read Bassmaster or watch the TV shows, and that's that they fish a lot of spots throughout a fishing day when they're fishing offshore. And they may mention it, but you don't really see it in action. And I know a lot of pros on tour, and they actually tell me that they fish 30 to 40 offshore spots a day. And they use the last secret I just talked about, and that's to not make more than 10 casts on the spot before moving on. And so these guys will pull up to an offshore spot that they mark in practice. They'll make 5 or 6 casts. If they don't get bit, pull up the trolling motor, and they move to the next spot. And if you actually watch Jacob Wheeler's YouTube channel, I'll leave a link down below. You can see him when he was fishing Lake Chatou for one of the Bassmaster tour events. I think it was the Bassmaster Classic bracket. And you can see in one of his videos, he's pulling up his trolling motor constantly, and he's fishing all these offshore cane piles with a topwater. And he's fishing a ton of spots a day, and he's only getting bit on 3 or 4 of those spots. But he normally catches multiple fish when he's doing that, and that's what I like to do in tournaments too. I play the numbers, and basically I think, okay, if I fish 40 spots a day, I'm hoping that 5 of those spots are going to have fish that are actively feeding, and I hit them at the right time. And that takes a lot of preparation because you have to find 40 spots, but not all the time you have to fish 40 different spots. You can sometimes just rotate 10 spots 4 times. So you can go to the first spot in the morning and make a milk run of 10 spots, then come back 2 hours later and see if the fish are actively feeding, if the weather conditions are right, whatever it is. So again, you don't have to have 40 unique spots. You just have to hit 40 areas throughout the day, even if you're repeating the same areas multiple times.
So guys, that's it. Those are 6 secrets to offshore bass fishing the pros didn't want you to know, but I shared them anyways, and hopefully they're gonna help you become a better bass fisherman. So if you enjoyed the video, hit like and subscribe down below. And if you have any comments or questions about the stuff I talked about in the video, leave them down below. And other than that, I'll see you next time.